Let's do this. This is the inaugural conversation with the Ergonauts, and we're going to have a good run. There has to be a first one, so this is a good time as any coming into the new year, and we got a new company, a new mission, and we're just going to have a little conversation with each other and say what we're trying to do. So what are we trying to do? I'm Andrew Clay Schaefer, and I'm trying to build something that everyone wants to need, wants to see, wants to need, needs to want. And I'm joined by some friends. Our strategy is to try to get interesting and smart people together and build things.
Absolutely.
So these are interesting and smart people.
Usually works. All right. I'm Sasha Rosenbaum. I'm the newest addition to the amazing company of Ergonautic, and we're going to help people navigate things. And I think actually we probably should start with Jabe explaining what ergonautic means. And
what kind of thing?
Without a warning.
Sure. Ergonautic is a interesting word. Ergo is work, but it's work in a particular kind of way. So it's both referencing the process of work, or like doing work, and the result of work. The result. It reminds me of design. So like design is the thing you do, but it's also the thing you produce. So like a designed object is the same kind of thing. It's designed. So yeah, the ergonautic is work, and then nautic is reference to nautical or steering. So it also is loosely related to ideas around cybernetics and steering of organizations. So work steering.
Going back to the ancient Greek. And you can read all about this on our first blog post.
Absolutely.
So on that topic, what is work? What is ergonautic? And then specifically, the types of work that we've done or that we focus on is related to this cyber something. Probably overloaded word there. Not that there's just not enough words colliding with each other.
Absolutely.
They're in buzzword bingo land.
So I think like a lot of the things that I like to play with around work is understanding the nature of work. So one of the things I think is a primary shift to get organizations to pay attention to the work more than the roles that are doing the work. So like most organizations, you go in, they're going to tell you about what roles they have, what people have those roles, who those people report to, some sort of Gantt charty idea about responsibilities and who's doing what when. And I think it's more interesting to ask the question, what's the nature of the work people are doing? What's the work like? Okay, now what do we need in order to do that work? What skills do we need? What teams do we need? What organizational capabilities do we need to be able to do the type of work that we've discovered?
There's also an aspect of this where what they tell you the work is not what the work is. Absolutely. That work as imagined is not the reality of their work, especially as you cross the boundaries of the roles.
Yep, I think that's right.
But is a much bigger problem, right? Because no one's actually doing what their job description says they do ever. And also, like, some people are very happy to do the thing that's not their job description. Some people are very unhappy to do it.
I think some of that's by necessity, and we talked about this in the larger context and some of the projects we're starting to work on now. But I have a hypothesis that no organization will hold together if everyone just does their job. That every organization is held together by people who are willing to be the glue that fills in the gaps between all the racy, whatever diagrams people made about what the job's supposed to be. And that goes from the line in the fast food restaurant to whatever the most biggest complicated technology organization you can imagine.
I think that's right. Everybody knows the kind of like idea that there's a formal network in an organization and an informal network, right? There's the teams on paper, and then there's actually how people talk or who talks to who. And I think work is like that as well, right? Like I call it a shoulder tap network, right? Like the idea that like the only way to really get things done is to go tap your friend on the shoulder and be like, hey, could you push that thing that I just did through the system a little bit faster? Because otherwise it'll just end up stuck where it is for a long time. And so
interestingly enough,
go ahead.
Yeah, interesting enough, everybody knows who to tap on the shoulder, but like that's this knowledge that exists inside the organization. And so everybody knows who they don't want to leave, but I don't think necessarily these people are rewarded or recognized as the linchpins that they are.
I think we're conflating two dynamics. So I agree with everything you said, that there's the network and the shoulder tapping. That is true, but that's somewhat different than the fact that there's work that people need to do to hold the whole thing together.
Yep, absolutely.
It's not in their job description.
Yep. Yeah, so I was trying to like make an analog as opposed to say they're the same. So I think, like you're saying, if there's a shadow network, there's shadow work in the same way. And part of what I was going to say is, and I think you can see this in work too, right? So the stronger and more clarified the formal network is, the stronger and the more hidden the informal network gets. Because the more you can't change the formal network effectively, the more you need the informal network to allow you to go around the edges of things and make things work so it doesn't snap, become brittle. And I think the same thing happens in work. Like the more overly specified and overly designed and overly integrated the work is, the more likely it is that there's really people behind the scenes pushing, shuttling, making things work. And that's interesting to discover. And it's often, again, one of the things I try to say to people sometimes is that most work in an organization, in my experience, is actually sitting in a queue in between teams. It's not actually in any teams. It's like waiting to get done between teams. And I think people are shocked to find out how much of the work in their organization is like sitting in a void between things.
Yeah, so it's interesting, like we were all discussing reading the book Flow, or I don't remember the full name because there's multiple books called Flow, so we have to specify which one that is.
I think it's the principles and practices of flow or something like that.
Production, something I cannot pronounce Donald's last name either, so that presents a problem. So Reinertsen, is that the correct way?
Correct. Yep, you got it right.
Yeah, so he pointed out in even the beginning of the book is we overfocus on how busy people are. So like we try to load every person to maximum capacity and we don't focus on where the work is. So the queuing process that you are referring to, which is, hey, is this work task? It's just sitting here waiting for the next person because everybody's too busy and there's actually no possibility of flow through the system.
Yep. It's an idea from
the principles of product development flow. That's
right. Yeah.
Title.
And so that's it. There's another book that's interesting around a similar thing, Sasha, and it describes the idea of what's called, in that book, they call it the difference between resource efficiency and flow efficiency. So there's some argument about whether or not this makes any sense, but we'll put the argument aside first. The argument for it says that if you do resource efficient planning, what you're doing is making sure everybody's busy. You're extracting as much work out of the resources as possible. But the argument for this is, especially when you get queues or backlogs or constraints or other terms to indicate that you have piles of uncompleted work, you could have lots of people doing work all the time and be producing very little value. In other words, very little software gets deployed, but there's just piles of stuff happening inside the organization. And so if you focus the other way, they call it flow efficiency. And the argument is like from someone having a good idea to getting that idea in production, how do you make that as efficient as possible? How do you increase the flow of value as quickly as possible? And so the way to kind of, I think, to grab onto that is to think about what we mean by flow. And flow to me is units of value delivered per time unit. So like you can pick whatever time unit you want, a week, a month, a day, but then you have to ask, have we delivered a unit of value? So then you get a secondary question, which is what is the unit of value? And I think that's really critical for a lot of teams because this is a standard bog stuff, right? Like sprint teams frequently don't finish anything valuable until the next sprint, right? They don't complete it. So they claim to be completing story points within 2 weeks, but they haven't actually flowed any value to a customer yet. So the question ends up, how do you figure that out? Yeah.
So the whole idea of value streams is interesting. Certainly something we focus on and talk about in our work right now. But I also think it's interesting to think about the socio-technical dynamic and then where it's like more social, where it's more technical. And for some of the conversations and some of the things that we're thinking about right now, the value stream is not just getting a unit deployed to some system, some server, it's the actual customer. So what is the barrier to adoption? What is the barrier to that actual value? And it's more than the software is running on a system now.
Yep.
So let's drill into like socio-technical. And I think one of the things I'm seeing more and more in a lot of discussions is people using this terminology somewhat naively or somewhat different than I think the kind of academic framing and the background in the research that we've been doing would say. So I think it's worth, just for the sake of the conversation, defining terms and the history of it, and then have a little bit of a riff about what we think. So do you want,
when
I
someone says defining terms, I just assume that Jabe's going to define terms. It's like, this is the default.
He's nominated too.
So the concept of sociotechnical systems as a specific theory, the concept of sociotechnical systems theory as a specific theory comes out of what's called the Tavistock Institute, which was formed by Eric Trist and a few other people, and in England. And it was the sociotechnical systems theory itself came out of a study of mining, coal mining. And it was the exact question we started with earlier with Flo. How do we extract more coal efficiently from the system, from the mine? And so the really interesting thing is that there's two forms of coal extraction in their report. And one is a three-man short wall method, which basically means one guy's got a pickaxe, one person has a basket, and one person is the runner. One person is knocking the coal out, another person is shoveling it into a basket, another person is carrying it from the wall to a train and dumping it and then coming back. And then the second one is what's called long wall. And long wall involved different crews. So not different people, different crews, different specializations would come down one after the other. So one crew would come down and set explosives in the wall, and then they would blow it up, and a second crew would come down and extract the coal onto conveyor belts that would pull it out of the system, and a third crew would come and push the conveyor belts forward, and then the first crew come back down and do the explosives again. And the really interesting thing that ends up happening is that the separate kind of siloization or specialization of different capabilities caused more problems than they expected. And part of it was that sometimes the explosives wouldn't explode enough of the roof, and so you couldn't get the pickaxe to work. So you'd basically be back to short wall, even though you were expected to be extracting at the rate of long wall, or all sorts of the interchanges between the different teams would go wrong. But of course, since they were on separate crews, they never talked to each other, and they only got to talk to each other basically through management. Can you tell the guys who are exploding things to do it differently? Whereas short wall was a team, a small, focused, almost completely autonomous team. Yep. That's right.
Fascinating reading some of those old papers, and what I think carries forward and repeats several times to get to here is this idea that this investment in automation and all of this kind of structure and planning doesn't outperform the autonomous team.
Absolutely.
And I think that theme's replayed over and over, whatever like buzzword you want to call the kind of like automation, DevOps stuff, where people put all this effort into automating things, but without bringing the socio side of it along to the new formalities or the new kind of process, then you don't get the increase in productivity that you expected based on the investment in automation.
Yep.
So to me, I think the conclusion is a little bit different. So I don't see this as much of a knock on automation as knock on horizontal. So if you think about it, one of these teams is horizontal.
It's not the knock on automation. What it is that if you automate without bringing the socio side of the system in line with the automation and a proportional investment, then the automation doesn't. All it really actually did was demoralize those teams.
What I was saying was that if you think about it, that one of these teams is horizontally structured and the other is vertically structured, right? So you have one of the teams is broken down by specialty, and then 10 people of one specialty or whatever, 2 people, whatever, doesn't matter, right? And you layer the cake. The other team is vertical. So I have everybody on the team who can deliver value. Like, so between me and the value, everybody I need is here. I think in my personal conclusion in software development, vertical teams are more efficient than horizontal teams. Because if you have a team that is responsible for, say, delivering a feature to the customer, and I have my own QA and I have 10% of the time of the SRE or whatever, I have everybody who is needed from design of the feature, like UX, like user research, whatever, to actual delivery of the end result to the customer, then I can get it all to work and I can get all these people to talk to each other. And it's not just, oh, QA sucks, they never test our code correctly or whatever. Because what matters is the customer satisfied with what the hell we delivered. Right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think like QA is one of the common examples. QA and TD are common examples of where this failure state occurs, because it's a heavy investment in automation with the assumption that the automation will prove valuable. And I think there's two ways of kind of thinking through how you can make things valuable or not with automation. So the classic paper on this is The Ironies of Automation, which argues that automation de-skills humans, right? So basically everything you automate in the organization, if there was a person doing it, now that the person's not doing it, when the automation breaks, no one will know what the thing was supposed to have been doing because nobody will have done it for a while. That's one argument. And the second argument is from Toyota, and that one is what's called automation or jidoka, which means automation with a human touch is technically what it means. And what they mean by that is you should never automate something to the point a human wouldn't have to pay attention to it anymore. So you like automate, but you automate only to the point where a human can still pay attention to the outcome.
That you're augmenting the humans. And
that's right.
A callback to some of the previous threads, I'm going to posit that the difference in efficiency, flow efficiency, with the vertically integrated versus horizontally integrated is the ability to fill in the gaps in the work and make up for the uncertainty. So in some perfect world, all these strong silos would be quote unquote more efficient. But in reality, it's all that variation that you have to fill in the gaps that makes it all fall apart. That's that they delaminate from each other in those silos.
It's also the feedback loops, right? Because I don't have to go through 3 hops to communicate with you. If you are doing something that's not optimized for me, I can just tell you. And so the feedback loop is a lot shorter.
And so that telling, right, is the socio part of sociotechnical systems. When you fracture a system by injecting new technology into it, you fracture the feedback loops too. And that's part of the story, right? Part of the story is not just that the 3-man wall is better on some level, but that the other wall fractures the social system. It breaks the communication apart so that the people aren't speaking with each other anymore. And they don't have a common investment in the outcome of the work and things like that. So I think that's another thing to think through here when we think about this stuff is there's this idea technology is not social, that it doesn't have any opinions about how things should be, but it's somehow magically
sweet summer child.
Not biased.
That's right.
You're not biased. Right.
Somehow it's unbiased without intent. Of course, the answer is that's not true. There are always winners and losers when you adopt new processes and techniques and things like this.
Actually, I was like,
sorry, go ahead, Sasha. Latency.
You did not interrupt. We just started talking at the same time. This is fine. So I think this is it's from a random book about AI and stuff, but there was a really interesting sentence in there. It was like, bias is a property of information. Bias is not a property of humans or machines or anything. It's a property of information, because if you have too much information to process every single thing case by case, you then generalize. The moment you generalize, you stereotype, you have bias, right? And whoever wins from the bias, it doesn't matter whoever wins from the bias, there's someone who's winning, because you can't be completely objective, because otherwise you deliberate every single case and the tiger eats you because, it's running faster and you are deliberating whether you should fight or flight.
So I think there's a similar...
There's no technology without bias, because there's always information bias. But even independent of this notion of winners and losers, a pattern we see over and over in these kind of like cloud migration, platform adoption projects is that in order to be successful, an organization needs multiple personas across the value stream to change their behavior, not necessarily simultaneously, but in some sort of new coordinated fashion. And I think that's where a lot of these struggles are happening. Whatever dynamic, and this goes a little bit back to this point about winners and losers, like someone will get the center of gravity to drive it, but they're not doing it in a way that's optimizing for the collective interests. So some of the selfish interests start to splinter off and maybe resist the effort.
Yep. I think, this happens a lot. Going back to the information point just really quickly, there's another concept that's called X formation, which I think is super interesting. So X formation is this really simple idea that says when the three of us get on a phone, we don't have to introduce ourselves again and then talk about all of our years of experience doing this or that. And we have a common set of understandings that we don't have to re-inject into the conversation every time we start a conversation. So there's specifically things that we have excluded as information from the conversation. So information and X-formation, now as you hear that in the information a little bit more, in is what's going into the formation of the system or the thought process, right? And X-formation is stuff that's being removed, but still allowing for formation, right? And so when you cross boundaries and you cross teams and silos and things like that, one of the problems isn't just the handoff of work, which is a problem. It's also not being able to communicate with each other because I expect some set of stuff, and so I just don't communicate it to you. But you don't know it because it's not your expertise. And the same thing going backwards. And so you get these kind of blank looks both ways.
Or
people
even
are
worse, everyone's using the same words, but they mean different things in all those different contexts.
100%. Absolutely.
So here's a question, and I ponder this sometimes, right? As we develop more and more technology, the word gets progressively more complicated, right? And so I can use a cell phone. Using it sometimes is painful. I tried to switch between Android and iPhone. It's really freaking painful. Using the technology is sometimes complicated. Now, I believe that if I went to school for the right things for a long enough period of time, I could build a cell phone. But as it is right now, I have no idea how to build it. I wouldn't know the first thing about how it operates. And speaking of still understanding how the automation operates, the idea of specialized teams repeatedly arises because we need more and more skills to complete the work. And it's impossible for everyone to be skilled at everything. And it's progressively impossible for even a lot of people to be skilled at a lot of things. Arguable point. But anyway, so how do we avoid this? Because I get upset when people start saying, oh, you should be a developer in an SRE and understand how to build the system from the ground up. And if you don't know anything about hardware, then you're a bad person. And why aren't you running your own kernel on Linux and whatever, right? It's your expectation is ridiculous, and we can't make progress if we make everybody learn everything. So how do we address?
I'm not sure I understand specifically what you're asking to avoid.
So there is a conflict between, for me to have the same understanding and vocabulary as you, I need to have the same learning experiences, and that's not possible because we get progressively specialized, right? And at the same time, I cannot request that people have some context for what everybody else is doing, but very superficial, right? So how do we address?
So the way I think about this is the stack is very deep and the stack is very wide, and there's going to be necessity for these technical skills and technical excellence, right? If you really want to build high-performing teams, high-throughput teams, what you hope to get to is technical excellence in all of those domains involving your value stream. And the cell phone example is very different than building a big web app and microservice architecture thing. So those are very different domains. But what you need to get all those personas to recognize is some collective interest that they're negotiating in favor of. It's not that you can get complete understanding across every domain about what every other domain is, but what you need to think through or try to design is how the feedback loops between those, hopefully cross-functional, kind of horizontal integrated teams, enable you to get technical excellence in each of the domains that are required for your value stream without kind of minimizing the turbulence and delamination that would come from everyone having their own selfish interests optimized.
Yep. So I think there's another term, Sasha, that's used in the resilience community and some of the naturalized decision-making people use this term too, is common ground. So the really interesting thing about common ground as an argument is it argues similar to what you're saying, which is not everyone will know everything about all things in order to create effective high-performing teams. But what they'll focus on in a high-performing team is the creation and reproduction of common ground, which is just the amount of just focused on what information we need to share to be effective. Like we assume other things, but we need you
that we don't know.
That we don't know. So one of the ways I try to explain it sometimes is I say, if you have, again, I'm going to try, so you don't common ground. You have, as a thing that an organization owns, what you have is a capability to produce and reproduce common ground. Is critical, right? Because what we need to know right now will change as the technology changes, as our team changes. Like we need to be able to reproduce common ground. And so I think that leads to this kind of interesting other thing, which is, I think the way to define whether or not you have common ground is whether you can watch someone else do their job and know enough about what they're doing that you don't necessarily agree that they're doing it right, or that you may even think there's another way of doing it, but you don't think what they're doing is completely crazy, or you don't, like, you have no understanding of why they're doing it at all. Common ground is the ability to look at someone and go, I might not do it that way, but I know why. I get that they're doing something and I understand that they're doing something, right? And so I think there's common ground, and then secondarily, I hate like the word cross-functional way because it seems to have gotten super polluted, but to me cross-functional means like shared practices, not shared occupancy on a team, right? Like the question is, what functions do we share, or what practices do we share? Not that we like live on the same team together. And I think that's a different question too. So I think like one of the things to ask in like a DevOps organization is like, what practices do the developers and the operators need to share? Oh, like they need some sort of observability. They need some sort of source control practice that enables the difference between code and right now, other things. As
it's not always about the practice, it's about the trading zone or the boundary object that enables the two sides. So they don't necessarily have the same practice per se, but those things come together in a way that the whole thing is a practice.
That's right. I agree with that.
So I think it works well to ask questions, like, so you have a chance to talk through things. And I think here's a thought experiment question. Like, if you, let's say we walk into an organization and we say people don't talk to each other, there's no common ground, there's no ability to communicate, everything is a silo, everything is very rigid, and people point fingers at each other, and also the flow of work is not flowing clearly to the end result that you want. How do we start unraveling this, and how do we start working through helping people?
These are the hard questions. So one of the other things that we're all doing right now, we mentioned the one book we're reading. We all started reading Tiny Habits, or some of us have read it already. I'm early in that book, but this is something that I've been reflecting on across a bunch of different engagements and experience that I've had, which is this focus on positivity. So I feel like there's lots of things that are happening in an organization that are maybe less positive, but you can also figure out there is work. There's no organization that doesn't have some work. It's about figuring out what is actually working and then iterating and improving that with these tiny progressive transitions, whatever vocabulary we want to build onto there, that I think enable you to do that. So it's not that you go in and be like, no one talks to each other. You have strong silos. Duh, that's why we called you. That's why you're here trying to help us. From there, figure out what does work. Where are these boundary objects? What are those trading zones that we could start to establish and help people make incremental progress by encouraging those kind of feedback loops between those disciplines?
So I think one of the interesting things is that, like, when we first started talking about creating this enterprise, I think one of the great things that you guys always talk about is that positivity, and positivity can have a negative aspect to it, by the way. There's such concept as toxic positivity, but
is the worst,
right? But the point isn't to pretend that things are rosy when they're not. The point is celebrate the things that are good, because we're all alive and enjoying life, and we're all like probably delivering value, otherwise the organizations wouldn't exist. And we all have this like tendency. So towards the end of the Tiny Habits, I think that was a part that I appreciate the most, because it's like, it's been just a few weeks since I started trying to implement this, but it's been really helpful. This celebration, and you celebrate the tiniest thing. You celebrate, you washed your mug after using it, and you celebrate that. And I think the idea is, and he spends quite a bit of time on it, is that as adults, we stop celebrating. We treat everything as, oh, you should have done it a week ago. Like everything is diminished. Everything is, and then what do you celebrate? A silly example, I completed an MBA degree. So do I celebrate at the point of completion of an MBA degree? That's a 3 years of like effort, and there's no logical way to celebrate it either. What do? Take yourself to fancy dinner once? Is that how you build the habit of investing of your furthering your education? That's not right. So you have to scope it in, and I think that this book is giving me the idea that you have to scope it in even a lot tinier than I thought you do, and literally celebrate every tiny thing, because that's like our monkey brains just want dopamine. Like that's, if you constantly tell yourself that you suck, you're not gonna do the behavior. Like if all you can see is like how you're not measuring up, like you're gonna avoid the thing that reminds you that you're not measuring up. If you constantly tell yourself like, you know what, you did one push-up, that one push-up is so great, just like amazing, great job, right? You can do more push-ups. Yeah, so I think that analogy works, right? Like you did one deployment in, say, a month. Amazing. That's a lot more than you did last year. I think it's funny. I was talking to someone who was like talking about, oh, this bank only deploys once in 11 days. That's so bad. I'm like, 5 years ago, a bank deploying every 11 days was like, oh my God, everybody would get promoted and get crazy. But this doesn't even happen. This is not an animal in existence. So let's just pause and be like, hey, we DevOps transformed ourselves into way better things over the past decade.
Yep.
Tiny habits. So I feel like we have
so I think like
conversation. We can keep talking, but one of the things I wanted to tell everyone is let's be projecting the positivity. We will start doing book clubs, and one of the ones that we're doing, and we already this, is the one around the Reinerson book around product development and the flow of product development. So there's a lot of interesting ideas that resonate with me and I think are related to the work we want to do and a lot of stuff we talked about today. So if anyone's interested in that, you can reach out to us and we'll figure out how to get you involved in that. We'll basically read parts of the book and then have some open discussions in a closed circle. Else, let's celebrate one tiny thing each to get into the new year, and then we'll call it a day. Get back to work.
All right, I'm gonna say, so I have no floor behind me because my basement flooded a couple weeks ago. I'm gonna celebrate two things. One, it flooded at a bad time, but not quite as bad as it could have been. So like I did managed to fix it in a day instead of 3 weeks, which would have been a lot worse. And then I'm going to also celebrate that I'm being a very adult person dealing with this, like talking to contractors and dealing with paying for things and delivering things and whatever, which normally I would avoid. So I'm like, good job, me. This is happening.
Adulting is hard. Good job.
Adulting is working right now. So let's celebrate that. Okay.
I think the obvious thing to celebrate right now is doing our first podcast. I think it's exciting and fun, and we'll learn more as we go along, but it was nice to do it and it's easy enough to get done, and let's do some more. It'll be fun.
So last thing, I feel really recharged from the holiday. I soaked in a lot of these experimental hacks I'm doing on myself to make the kind of investments in myself in this endeavor, and that I'm feeling very blessed and thankful to have smart, motivated people like yourselves to go on an adventure together.
It's going to be fun.